Okay. So far in our considerations of fundamental moral theology, we went back to the beginning to examine certain principles, but in particular some fundamental starting points, namely, first of all, our purpose in life. Where are we going? After that, we looked a little bit at what we call human actions, namely a few considerations of both knowledge and freedom, so that we can really take responsibility for the things that we do or that we don't do, and that we can really call them our own. Obviously, if we're not free, if free will doesn't exist, then we really can't talk about moral responsibility. So first, the goal of our whole life that we were aiming for, then human knowledge, human freedom, both of which God gave us to help us get to that goal. Then we examined the principles or the fonts of morality. Again, nothing specific like why telling the truth is good or why murder is wrong, but why we call anything right or wrong, why we speak of good or evil at all. After that, we moved on to a norm, and that external norm was what we called moral law, be that natural or divine law, and that's the external norm of morality. And also now, today, we'd like to consider what we call the internal norm of morality, which is conscience. This particular consideration, particularly in our American situation, needs a great deal of attention and some careful distinctions, because frankly, everybody is using the term conscience, but it's not always used in the same way. So what I'd like to do is outline somewhat the nature and the function and the position or the function of conscience, and spell this one out a little bit more slowly because it's enormously practical. One of the problems is, this is surely one of the most discussed and probably one of the most important considerations, but largely one of the most misunderstood considerations in moral theology. It just happens that we live in a society which has not yet agreed, at least in the civil order, on a definition that is acceptable to everyone. Our little rule up to now, whenever there was confusion, was to go back and look for principles located in Scripture that have been clarified in sacred tradition, that have been taught in any given age by the teaching church. And we're going to do that with the notion of conscience as well. We can go back to Holy Scripture. Actually, in this instance, if we were to look in the Old Testament, we're going to be a little bit disappointed. The Old Testament was notoriously unpsychological. Some believe that in Ecclesiastes 10:20 there is a mention of inner self-reflection that sounds like conscience, but that's not part of the Hebrew Bible. And we just really don't find that much consideration. Mentions of motivation, for instance, in the Old Testament were usually on the surface. Many of the authors of both Testaments, and in fact many of the fathers of the church, when they addressed external conduct, that's what they paid attention to, not too much psychological motivation one way or the other. However, when we check the New Testament, we will find the word conscience appears 28 times in the singular and once in the plural, largely in the works of St. Paul. There is a Greek word, synedesis. I don't know if you can use that at Scrabble or not, but this particular word is the Koine Greek word for conscience, and it appears that what St. Paul did was simply take that word out of Koine Greek, was the common Greek that was spoken by educated people in our Lord's time in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And this is the language in which the Scriptures, the New Testament, was originally written, in Koine Greek. And St. Paul simply took that term. Now, the way St. Paul understood it was rather simply like this, that God so created us, and the nature of man is such that were we to go beyond or outside the limits of our God-created nature, we would feel the sting of synedesis. We would feel the sting of conscience. For St. Paul, it's almost always something retrospective, looking back, recalling or remembering not at all what we call prospective or directive of conduct. It's always about one's own conduct, as St. Paul uses it, never about someone else's. Now, this is a legitimate use, no doubt about it. However, when we get into modern discussions, some of which are medieval, we're going to find that that particular use is a little bit too narrow, I think. If we were to come up with modern examples, we have lots of modern examples, and that's why I just want to slow down a little bit to define what it is that we're talking about. Everybody's talking about conscience. For instance, some years ago, 1972, there was an explosion in the University of Wisconsin in the Mathematics Center in which a certain Robert Fastnack, the father of 3 children, was killed. This bomb was set off by a certain Lewis Carlton Armstrong, who was subsequently arrested by, of all people, the Northwest Mounted Police. When Mr. Armstrong was arrested for blowing up the Mathematics Center at the University of Wisconsin, his father was quoted in the New York Times the next day saying, "I didn't raise my kids to be bums or hoodlums. I didn't do this in their upbringing. If my son did this, he did it because he had a conscience." Well, now there's a use of the word conscience. Another, a certain Lynette Fromm made an attempt on the life of one Gerald Ford, who, when she was apprehended, was also quoted in the New York Times the next day by saying, "I know they're out there killing the whales every day, and I had to do something because I did this because of conscience." Well, there's another word, use of the word conscience. At one point in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., a group of Hanafi Muslims took possession of a building and kind of kidnapped temporarily 134 persons. Several members from Arab embassies were called over to the State Department. A motion was made that maybe some offer could be made so that they could let these innocent people go free. The 3 Arab diplomats all were a little bit repelled by saying, "We can't offer these men money because they're acting out of conscience." Conscience, conscience, everyone's talking conscience. In my own home state of New York, some years ago, Governor Carey made a remark that made the quotation of the day in the New York Times, and it's such an important quotation, I have to read it because I wouldn't want anyone to think that I was misquoting our former governor. After exhibiting a little schizophrenia about his personal inability to accept the death penalty, but his insistence on funding abortions, Governor Carey made the remark that my mind doesn't govern my conscience governs my mind. I don't have a clue what that means. Maybe the governor has a mindless conscience or a conscienceless mind. I don't know what that means, but everybody and his brother, and not just his brothers, but some of our sisters are talking in funny ways about conscience. Mr. Alvarado, who was the head of the school system, the chancellor of the school system in the city of New York, was also quoted in the New York Times after he was found to be using all sorts of money he had no right to use by saying, "You see, it's difficult if your values are different from the values by which you are being judged. If you're judged by these values, of course, you come out wanting." And this man was the head of a school system. It's very peculiar. But it also gets important. During the presidential election in the autumn of 1984, a certain Geraldine Ferraro made a number of remarks about her personal convictions about abortion and the teaching of the Catholic Church. And even more alarming than that were some of the quoted remarks of Mrs. Ferraro's pastor, who at one point, and again I read it, it's the only time I'm going to read anything to you because I don't want to give anyone impression that I'm making these up. After a particularly atrocious statement, there appeared an assigned article in the New York Daily News on July 23, 1984, and you'll find it on page 29. Quote, this is the pastor saying, "One of the most basic tenets of the Catholic Church is the supremacy of individual conscience, and we have to respect one another's conscience," end quote. Quote again, "Obviously, she is not a stupid woman. She knows the teachings of the Church and has formed her own opinions. They have to be respected. She herself respects the Church's teachings. I personally respect her," end quote. Without qualification, remarks and reasoning like that are disastrous. Of course, we must respect each other, and we respect each other's conscience in a sense, but respect for each other does not wipe out what is objectively right and wrong. Do you think the same pastor would say of an usher, who not only the usher takes up the collection on Sunday, but then he takes it home and keeps it and spends it on the lottery or perhaps on other forms of public entertainment? Do you think the proper answer to that man is, well, he's a Catholic, he's not a stupid man, he respects the teaching of the church? Friend, we're talking about a thief whose conscience is erroneous, and it must be corrected. It must be in conformity with the truth to be a truly Catholic conscience. The same would apply to Carlton Lewis Armstrong. The same will apply to Miss Fromm, and the same should apply to Mrs. Geraldine Ferraro or anyone else. But to just make statements like these, so this is the reason why I pause a little bit. A couple of examples are on the surface perhaps a little bit silly, but some of the language and the terminology is so polluted in the conscience area that if we don't clean up the language, we're not going to clean up the thinking, because there's definitely a connection between language, the terms that we employ, and the thinking that we endorse. So to some extent, we try the impossible. But one of the things that we have to insist on, particularly in the area of conscience, is we're going to try and use common sense speech and clean terminology. Actually, we have a little bit of a benefit in our English language with the word conscience. Because, for instance, there's a word that's somewhat close to it, but different, both in its meaning and understanding. There's a much more psychological word in English that's called consciousness. We're not talking about that. We are aware of it, and we know what it means. But fortunately, in English, at least with this noun, we're going to run into all sorts of trouble with funny adjectives in the conscience area. But with the noun, I believe in French, conscience means both, and in some other Romance languages. But in English, we have at least this difference. What does the word really mean? Well, it's a compound from two Latin words. Scientia in Latin means knowledge. Knowledge cum, with or of one's self, basically. Psychologically, very often it means reflecting, and it's retrospective, it's remembering, it's recalling, it's calling back to mind, if you will, dwelling on consciousness. But in the moral sense, it really has to do with a judgment and a decision. I offer here another small caution. In the area of conscience and conscience discussion, we will employ, and I believe properly, a number of metaphors, a large number of metaphors, which is perfectly okay, provided we realize that they are metaphors. Some will speak of the voice of God. Some will speak of that little voice within my so-called heart of hearts. Or some will speak of the inner voice within. Even the documents of the church sometimes use. Now, realize these are legitimate metaphors, provided we realize that they are metaphors and therefore have the limitation of a metaphor. If someone really is convinced that conscience is the voice of God and they sit around waiting for the voice of God, God may decide on given instances to reveal himself in such a way. But there are certain atrocious forms of human behavior that can never be blamed on God and should never be blamed on the inspiration of the Holy Spirit either. Conscience is not a sensitivity. Conscience is not some kind of a peculiar part of our mind, as if one part of our brain is reserved for biology and another part is for spelling and another part is for nutrition or something like that. Conscience basically is the intellect itself that makes practical judgments. And here again, when we come to spelling out its function, it's important that we not confuse each other, and I'm quite capable of doing that. I know I can confuse others because I can confuse myself, that somehow this is very esoteric and complicated. It's not. We're talking about a practical judgment, a practical decision, practical decisions of conscience. Just as we have to make practical decisions everywhere else in life, so we make practical decisions in the moral life. When we practically decide that such and such is good and should be done by me, and that such and such is evil and should be avoided by me. It's that practical, and we make practical decisions all the time. because we either do things or we don't do things. It's not all that theoretical. Now again, psychology has a broader understanding, and so does our common framework of reference. We sometimes say that conscience, we feel the guilt of conscience or the pangs of conscience, or conscience is said to sting or to accuse or to assuage or to prompt. We understand all of those meanings, and we embrace some of them. But its particular use in Catholic moral theology is about a decision, that is, about a judgment, about the moral quality of an action which is prospective, here and now, and directive of our conduct, that we do this or we don't do that. So, although there is a retrospective sense of remembering and recollecting, and we acknowledge that, the particular function of conscience that we pay most attention to is that part that is directive and prospective. It is directive of our prospective here and now activity. Let me put this perhaps in a most extreme example. I give you a crazy sounding statement. My conscience does not tell me that what John Hinckley did to Ronald Reagan is wrong. My conscience doesn't tell me what John Hinckley did or tried to do to Ronald Reagan is wrong. Now you wonder, what's the matter with this guy's conscience? Is there something the matter with his character? Let me put it this way. On the level of right and wrong, the most fundamental principle available, the most general one, and they say it's so general because it really cannot be denied, is the basic premise that good should be done and sought and evil avoided. But obviously that's a very general statement. In fact, it's the most general moral statement. And they say, most of the doctors and the writers in the church, that that is so fundamental that you just can't really deny it. Let's make it a little bit more particular. Good should be done and sought, evil avoided. We make it particular. It is wrong to kill an innocent person. Well, certainly that's a little bit more particularized than the first statement. The first statement was good should be done and sought, evil avoided. Second statement, more particularized. It is wrong to kill an innocent person, that should be avoided. Let's particularize it a little bit more. Thirdly, we say it is wrong to kill this innocent person, Ronald Reagan, and that should be avoided. Well, certainly that's far more particularized than our first statement. But here comes the employment of the true function of the nature of conscience in Catholic moral theology. This fourth step, it is wrong to kill this innocent person, Ronald Reagan, and that should be avoided by me. It is that particular application of my prospective activity which is directive of me. It's directing me away from that wrong kind of act. That's the particular judgment of conscience. That's the particular decision of conscience that most concerns Catholic moral theology. In technical terms, that's what we call antecedent conscience. Consequent conscience is when we're looking back, recalling, sometimes preparing for confession or examining our conscience. But when a proposed activity is before us and we make a judgment, our notion of right and wrong, that good should be done and evil avoided, I could get that from regular moral wisdom. I would learn that from my parents. I would learn that from God's commandments. I didn't invent any of that. All of that external moral law. But conscience is the element that takes that moral wisdom, that takes that moral teaching and applies it to here and now conduct, and it is then directive of my conduct. And in this sense, this is the function of conscience that everybody has, and everyone must apply, and that's what we call antecedent conscience. And this is what is of the chief interest to the moral theologian. Conscience does not make law. Conscience does not invent right and wrong. Conscience applies what's right and wrong to here and now activity. Most of what I say about the fundamental concepts here, I think, apply to all religions. The last 5 or 10% of what I say will be obviously particularized and applied to Catholic moral theology. Okay? But again, conscience doesn't make murder wrong. God's law tells us that murder is wrong. Conscience is the application that this particular attack on this particular innocent individual, which is a direct attack, this is murder, and that should be avoided by me. That is the judgment of conscience. That's the function or the decision. And it's very practical. You don't have to have a PhD to figure that out. In fact, there are some wrong things for which you do need a PhD, like computer espionage and things like that. But even there, who makes up the right and wrong of ownership and copyrights and stealing? My conscience doesn't invent that, but my conscience applies this moral wisdom from whatever source, Almighty God's revelation, or just plain reasoning, or the teaching of Buddha for Buddhists, or the teaching of the prophet Moroni for Mormons, or what have you. And it's that particular application that most concerns Catholic moral theology. Okay, so there are always going to be, conscience says, don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. Okay. But law, as a matter of fact, would be useless if we didn't have this ability to take moral wisdom, to take moral learning, to take God's commandments and apply them to here and now concrete activity, prospective activity, which is directive of me, that I should do what is good and I should avoid what is evil. But prior to that, there has to be a judgment. This is good and should be done and sought by me. This is wrong and this should be avoided by me. That is the function of conscience that most concerns morality. And again, we don't want to overdose on what's theoretical and abstruse and a mile and a half beyond the planet Pluto. That's not our concern. We're talking about a practical judgment, just like you make practical judgments in every other area of life, no matter how wise someone is. Example, a man or a woman is in business. It's very important in business to know, I suppose, interest rates and certificates of deposit and money markets and Ginnie Maes and tax shelters and all of that jazz. However, you can have 5 master's degrees in business administration from the Harvard Business School and everywhere else. But when someone is in a business, someone has to take all that theoretical knowledge and make a practical decision. This store opens at 9 and closes at 5. It's a practical decision. A PhD in economics won't make that decision for you. Telling them you got out of the Harvard Business School won't do it for you either. Someone takes that knowledge and applies it to a practical here and now decision. Practical decision, okay? Same thing in healthcare and nutrition. It would be nice, we're told by all sorts of magazines and experts, that there's good food and there's junk food. And some people tell us that we have too much salt or we don't have enough salt. And this causes arteriosclerosis and that does. You can have all sorts of knowledge, medical, biological knowledge. But all those degrees and all that information is useless unless someone makes a practical judgment. Well, we're going to give the kids frankfurters for breakfast or not. It's a practical decision. Okay? Same with healthcare. Same with personal finance. Same with business. Same with everything. Same with morality. The rules of right and wrong, God's revelation, the commandments, just civil laws, we need to take all of that from whatever source and we apply it to here and now practical judgments. This is good and should be done by me. This is evil and should be avoided by me. That's the decision. That's the judgment of conscience that is most important. And realize this is not a feeling. Many people now start their sentences by saying, oh, I feel this is right, or I feel that's wrong. You can't be wrong in your feelings. I might have to revise that statement, but yeah, you can't be wrong. I mean, if you feel that green is your favorite color, that's the way you feel. Don't be upset if other people feel other way, because they do. There's really not a right and wrong about aesthetic taste like that. But if I say that I think that the walls here are pink, as soon as I say think, I got to give reasons. And if I keep insisting that I think the walls here are pink, someone's going to conclude either this guy doesn't know what the word pink means, or perhaps he's colorblind, or there's some other explanation for his obvious error. But if I say I feel pink is my favorite color, which it's not, really for moral reasons, that would be something else. Okay, so we're not talking about a feeling. We're talking about a judgment. We're talking about a decision. And it is because we are talking about a judgment and because we are talking about a decision, a very important distinction comes up that we cannot forget. If we are talking about a decision and a judgment, there are always two possibilities. In our judgment, we can be correct or we can be mistaken. That's the way it is in business. That's the way it is in healthcare. That's the way it is in water safety. That's the way it is in changing a flat tire. When we make judgments, there are always two possibilities. As a matter of fact, Konrad Adenauer, the former Chancellor of Germany, used to make the remark when he was alive that he thought God was a little bit unfair. Why? Because God put obvious limitations on our intelligence, but God never put any limitation on our stupidity. That's the problem. And what can happen? We can make a mistake in our judgment. So when we're talking about conscience, and we're really talking about antecedent conscience, we're talking about judgments and decisions. Therefore, there are always going to be two considerations. One of them will be objective, what we call, let's put down here object. And on the other side, we'll put down subject. And in conscience discussions, there's always going to be an objective consideration and a subjective consideration. An objective component, a subjective component. An objective polarity and a subjective polarity. What's the object? The object is the objective, what we call objective right and wrong decisions or judgments about objective reality. When we make judgments, when we say that something is objectively good, that means it really truly is good. And when we say it's objectively wrong, that it really truly is wrong. Well, since it is a judgment, sometimes we can be wrong about that judgment. Our judgments can be out of tune with reality, if you will. Or we might start with the right premise and draw the wrong conclusions. Well, we could start with a wrong premise. If I start off a discussion by saying, since there are 51 states in the United States, it follows, nothing follows from that statement because it's not true that there are 51 states. There aren't. Or I could start with a correct premise. All the Chevrolets I saw today were blue. Therefore, all Chevrolets are blue. That doesn't follow. Maybe it's true all the Chevrolets I saw today are blue. The only thing that follows from that is all the Chevrolets I saw today were blue. So sometimes we can start with the right premise and we can draw the wrong conclusion. Or sometimes we can start with the wrong premise. This is not a matter of judging personal worth. It's a matter of whether or not a judgment is in tune with objective reality. Therefore, on the objective side, we make a judgment that can be called objectively correct or objectively erroneous. What does that mean? Well, it means basically what it says. When I judge as right what truly objectively is right, then I have made an objectively correct judgment of conscience. Okay? When I judge as right what is objectively wrong, or judge as wrong what is objectively right, I have made an erroneous judgment of conscience. Okay? And these are both parts of the understanding. When I judge as right what is objectively right and objectively correct. Now, on the other side, it's the subjects, human persons. It's you, it's me. It's all subjects who make these decisions of conscience. And in my subjective decision of conscience, I as a subject, or you as a subject, could be subjectively certain, or I could be, as a subject, doubtful. Doubtful about the rightness or wrongness, the objective rightness or wrongness of a decision. Doubtful. And here we come up, and this is the terminology of the Second Vatican Council. This is the terminology of Catholic moral theology. And I trot out and examine this terminology as carefully as we can on purpose. I'm really moving down into slow motion because of some of the prior examples that I gave, some of which are a little bit absurd, but some of which are pointed and painful. And it's that business about cleaning up our language, because if we use sloppy language here, as the pastor of Mrs. Ferraro did, we might be covering up for the killing of innocent people simply by using polluted language. So here we want to be clear, okay? Objectively correct or objectively erroneous, subjectively certain, subjectively doubtful. That leads to the two little Catholic rules that you can always act on a certain conscience, you should never act on a doubtful one. You can always act on a certain conscience, you should never act on a doubtful one. Now, what do I mean about doubtful one? We have classic examples, both in moral and civil law. Say two fellows are hunting. It's early in the morning, there's a little fog, a little mist. They become separated. Something is moving out there. I am not certain, whether it is my partner or not. I have a doubt. Now, is that what's moving out there? Is that my partner, or is that the big brown Alaskan bear? Well, I tell you what, I'm going to shoot first and find out afterwards. No. By both civil and moral law, you would be held accountable for voluntary manslaughter there, if not homicide. So that when we say we can always act on a certain, if I'm certain it's the brown bear, okay, go ahead and shoot, if you're into shooting brown bears. But if you're doubtful, obviously you cannot act on that doubt, because in effect you're saying, well, whether it's him or not, I'm going to shoot first and find out afterward. Now, we don't want to be obsessed with these terms, because some have gotten carried away with the certainty that is required. The type of certainty that we're talking about here is what we call moral certitude. This is the type of certitude that prudent people use in all other areas of life, just like the examples we used before, on fixing healthy food for children, on making business decisions. Do we look for metaphysical certitude where there couldn't possibly or probably be any doubt whatsoever? Well, no, we don't, because we're not that absolutely metaphysically certain about all that many things. I am absolutely metaphysically certain that neither you nor I will sprout wings and fly, because that's a change of being. However, even lower than that is what we call physical certitude. Physical certitude is the absence of positive doubts. Now, most of the time we take that for granted as well. Whatever room you are now sitting in, I doubt very much that before you walked into that room, you knelt down to test the floor to see whether it would hold you up. It is possible, it might not. But we don't usually operate on that level. The level of common operating procedure is what we call moral certitude. Moral certitude is simply the absence of probable doubts, not of possibilities. There's some possibilities that you can't exclude. And if you had to exclude them, we would grind down to some solipsistic position where you never get out of bed in the morning because life is too dangerous. For instance, generally speaking, the convention in this country is that we stop for red lights and we go through green ones. That's a convention. There are parts of the country, namely Manhattan and New York City, where that agreement is really not in force. But if to figure, well, I'm going to be a very safe person, so I'm going to stop for both the reds and the greens. Life will become complicated. If, however, you're out there on Route 80 humming along and you see at an intersection where someone else is coming along at 80 miles an hour and has no intention of stopping, then you have a probable doubt, not a mere possibility. You have positive evidence and that type of thing. But generally speaking, whether it's business, whether it's food, whether it's health, whether it's first aid, whether it's morality, generally speaking, we say you can always act on a certain conscience, but we do not act on a doubtful one. What do? You resolve the doubt. You seek advice. You pray. If it's complicated, you consult someone who's lived long enough and well enough to know what they're really talking about. Or perhaps in complicated things, we seek the advice or the opinion of an expert who's not just learned, but better than that, holy. We consult the saints. Good procedure in life. But that's how we resolve a doubt. And that's the way we do. I mean, if we have a doubt whether this particular can of Chef Boyardee is tainted with botulism or not, if we really have probable cause, probable evidence, we don't act on that doubt, we resolve it, as we do in other practical areas. Again, what we're talking about here in the area of morality is not terribly esoteric. We're talking about practical decisions, and therefore we're talking about practical certitude, the kind of certitude that people need, prudent people need to act on so that they can act safely and in the knowledge that they are in accord with, if they're Christian, the laws of God and of His church. So, We can always act on a certain conscience. We do not act on a doubtful one. What do we try to do? We resolve the doubt. Now, problems come up, of course, because this analysis, it should be obvious that the best of all possible worlds is both an objectively correct conscience and a subjectively certain one. Certain and correct conscience is the best of all possible worlds. If we go back to the fathers of the church, we'll usually find that any time there was any external wrongdoing, they just said, that's wrong, it shouldn't be done, and that was the end of the discussion. A very learned monk, but in this case, I suppose, truly a friar, Thomas Aquinas came up with a shrewd distinction here about the difference between a correct and an erroneous conscience. What is to be said if someone is subjectively certain but objectively erroneous? That's a little bit different. For instance, we will take for granted that stealing is wrong. It is God's seventh commandment. For this purpose, we will define it as taking against the reasonable will of the owner. When what is taken is what we call grave matter, then it is seriously wrong. Okay? Case, example. Someone plans for weeks to steal a very expensive $5 million diamond out of the window of Tiffany there on Fifth Avenue. And they have it all planned. And the store is closed and they come down. Unbeknownst to this crook, Tiffany removes the diamond from the window after 5 o'clock and puts in its place a 3-cent piece of glass that looks just like it. But this guy is convinced that it's a $5 million diamond. And he goes ahead and he robs it. Okay? Now, morally, is he guilty of grave wrongdoing? In fact, that is, in terms of objective reality, he is stealing a 3-cent piece of glass. But subjectively, he is convinced that he's taking something that's $5 million. Now, $5 million, I think even by the standards of so-called liberal moral theologians, would be considered grave matter. If $5 million is in grave matter, we may as well erase that commandment. But now St. Thomas then would introduce the distinction that since the person was subjectively certain that he was committing grave matter, but he was objectively erroneous, then Aquinas says he is guilty of serious sin, even though his judgment was out of contact with reality. Let's reverse it. Let's turn it around and say someone thinks they're taking a 3-cent piece of glass. I'm not making a case for 3-cent thieves. But by anyone's definition, that would be small or what we call light matter. It would not be serious sins, nothing to quibble about, particularly if you need the 3 cents. But now, what happens there, but say in a given instance that it turns out that it's not a 3-cent piece of glass, in fact it really is a $5 million diamond. Now the question is that person guilty of grave wrongdoing? Well, according to Aquinas, the answer is no, because he was subjectively certain that he was doing something small. Now, of course, in the civil order, this cuts no ice. I mean, you might bring this distinction with you into jail, because that's where they're going to put you for stealing if they catch you, I suppose. So it cuts both ways, and that's why he can say in his rule that we can always act on a certain conscience, and we should never act on a doubtful one. What do we do with a doubtful one? We resolve the doubt. Now, it's here, of course, that something very important comes about and should come about. And after those 2 little rules, always act on a certain conscience, never act on a doubtful one, some people today, and a lot of people who teach moral theology, and a number of them who dress as I do, then say, follow your conscience and say no more. At this particular point in our lives and our history, that's a very misleading statement, because it should by now be obvious that apart from following our conscience, there is a prior and a primary responsibility of forming and informing a correct conscience in the first place, and no one is dispensed from that. No one, not even the Pope. The Holy Father has to make efforts daily to form and inform his correct Catholic conscience, as I do, as you do, as everyone does. No one is dispensed. As for the mechanics, I said in the beginning that I believe in this traditional acceptation, the traditional terminology and distinctions. Any religion can subscribe to this. There's no problem in that regard. Now, obviously, in the effort of forming and informing a correct conscience in the first place, there are going to be some differences, and they are important. If someone were to say here and now, simply follow your conscience and say no more, that's really, it's a half-truth, which, like a half-brick, you can throw twice as far. And here we have to get painfully honest. I make two claims. I claim to be Catholic. I claim to have a conscience. Both of those are claims. That I claim to have a conscience, you're going to have to take that on faith. And that I claim to be Catholic, you're going to have to take that on faith. Because just claiming to be Catholic and claiming to have a conscience does not automatically guarantee that in point of fact I truly have a real Catholic conscience. Because that work of formation of conscience goes on for me all the time. And here's where we got to be honest. If somebody rejects as unwelcome any messages from the magisterium of the Catholic Church which they don't like, let's admit that up front and don't play games with the word or the notion of conscience. You know, if someone is running around saying, well, I'm a liberated 20th century type, I am into reverencing significant others in my life, and I'm against authority, so that I'm not really for the Pope, but I'm for my favorite local theologian. Hey, look, friend, you're still arguing from authority. Every argument in theology is an argument from authority, ultimately the authority of revelation. But if someone is really kind of taking the line of their favorite local theologian while rejecting the Pope, they're still arguing from authority. They're arguing from the authority of their favorite local theologian, whose credentials, of course, pale to insignificance next to that of the Vicar of Christ. But they're still arguing from authority. And we want to be careful that we're not playing games. I mean, even in Catholic circles now, we have the expression of shopping. Shopping around. You know, if you don't succeed at first, try another priest. There's some priest somewhere in this country who will probably tell you water runs uphill, or some other strange thing. And this is where we got to be honest, because no one can make these judgments for us. We are all accountable for the formation of our own correct conscience. So if someone's going to say, I don't like what the church teaches, or I not only don't like it, but I'm going to have nothing to do. Let's say that up front, rather than saying or pretending that everyone's really going along the same track when they're not. If I want to fly the Catholic flag, and I do, well then there's an obligation that devolves upon me to form and inform my Catholic conscience correctly in the first place. Because factor for factor, the most important part of the formation of my correct Catholic conscience is, of course, the teaching of the Catholic Church. This is where I said before and predicted there would be differences. Obviously, if I were a Buddhist and interested in a correct conscience, obviously the teaching of Buddhism would be very important in the formation of my correct Buddhist conscience. If I were a Mormon, the teaching of the Prophet Moroni, or the Book of Mormon, would be very important in the formation of my Mormon conscience. I make no such claim there. I do claim to fly the Catholic flag. Therefore, the teaching of the Catholic Church is essential, in fact, crucial, to the correct formation of my Catholic conscience, because it's possible to claim to be Catholic and have an erroneous conscience. The present confusion, for instance, in the Church, the winds of doctrine are blowing all over the place. Now, someone will say, oh, well, you know, he had a Catholic upbringing. How far can the apple fall from the tree? How far can the apple fall from the tree? In a hurricane, the apple can fall far from the tree. Well, I went to a Catholic grade school for 8 years. I did. And I went to a Catholic high school for 4 years. And I did. And I went to a Catholic college for 4 years. I did that too. I went to a Catholic seminary for 4 more years of theology. I did that too. And then after I was ordained, they sent me back to the once Catholic university, possibly for remedial reading or whatever they sent me there for. And I went to public kindergarten, so I've seen both sides. I mean, I don't want you to think I grew up in a ghetto of some kind. But with all of that Catholic training, then automatically no. That would be a good context in which I would hope all the significant agencies of responsibility, my parents, my school, and my church, all said the same thing. And I use all of them to help me form a correct Catholic conscience. But it is possible today, as many parents have painfully learned, that you can sometimes send a child or a youngster to a religious affiliated college and they'll come back with a degree but not necessarily come back with a religious affiliation. And that's not progress, sadly. Sadly. So this effort on forming and informing a Catholic conscience is crucial. And why is it sometimes difficult? I'm not here to underline difficulty. I think it's a challenge and it's a joy to know that we are living the truth. One of the reasons that it's a little bit difficult is, of course, in the area of conscience, we are making interested judgments. Interested judgments. This is good and should be done by me. That engages me. Or this is good and should be avoided by me. That engages me. That's not quite the same as a judgment in spelling. I can make a mistake in spelling. The world doesn't end, and I don't lose sleep. I can make other mistakes. I can be in error about a number of things. But of course, in the moral area, there's a pinch. There is, I follow through. I put this into practice. Most of us are experts on deciding what other people should do and what they should refrain from. Here, of course, we are accountable with what I should do, what I should seek, what I should implement because it's right, and also what I should avoid or what I must avoid because it's wrong. And it's that pinch that comes through. Cardinal Newman, who was a gentleman not known for his humor, put it this way, that the aim of most conscientious and religious men is not first how to please God, but first how to please themselves without displeasing God. And I think the learned cardinal is onto something there, that the aim of most conscientious people, I'll call you conscientious, you can see that I'm conscientious, so now we're even and we're friends, that the aim of most conscientious and even religious people is not always first how to please God, but very often it's first how to please ourselves without displeasing God. That's what I mean by an interested judgment. And it's very important on this effort of forming and informing a correct conscience in the first place, never trivialize what's going on here, because what's going on here is a very big thing. The old prod of so-called conscience, or the better self, only goes against the better self for as long as there's a better self to go against. It is possible. It is possible to come to terms with a thoroughly corrupt lifestyle. It's possible. We call that a dead conscience. A dead conscience. St. Paul, toward the end of the first chapter of Romans, describes this as both the result and the penalty of wrongdoing. It happens. Say someone works for the mafia, they're paid $10,000, although in inflationary days I suppose it's $30,000 to knock someone off. Do you really think they spend the night before tossing and turning and wrestling with their conscience? Maybe. I don't think so. Now that's an extreme example, because it's a dead conscience, at least in that area. That's an extreme example. I think much more realistic is what I would tend to call a Swiss cheese conscience. A Swiss cheese conscience has strategic holes in it. Now, as I understand human nature and the little I know of human experience, nobody is exempt from this. What do I mean? Generally speaking, what I'm good at, I talk up. And what I'm not good at, I change the subject. And so do you. We're just built this way. What we like, what we're in favor of, what we follow through on, we tend to talk that up. Where we have personal difficulty or shortcomings, you change the subject. You can see it all the time. And little kids can figure this out. Little children have magnificent antennae. They always seem to know exactly what we don't want to talk about. It's just some kind of personal magnetism God put in their little baptismal souls so that they can drive you nuts with the wrong question. And that's the way we are. You know, if I have sticky fingers, I don't really want to spend most of the time talking about the rights and wrongs of stealing. But if I've never stolen anything in my life, I usually go with that very clearly. Sometimes it's what I call long-distance morality. Long-distance morality is normally when we have the answers for all the type of things that we're not involved in. And then yet sometimes when it comes down to something that's really right under my own nose and very much within my own control, aphasia sets in. All of a sudden I can't hear, I can't reason logically, I can't talk. So Cardinal Newman was correct. We must not trivialize with this important area of the correct formation, and in our circumstances today, the correct formation of a Catholic conscience. Why? Only the individual knows the particular circumstances of certain actions. Only the individual knows the underlying motivations, and this can't be delegated out. You can't say that, well, I went to the 8th grade, or in fact I memorized the Baltimore Catechism. I did. It's a good base, but there's more to learn. It's not for me to say whether things are easier today or more difficult, and I think it's usually stupid to talk about things like, well, my grandparents didn't have any problems and all the problems are brand new and modern. I'm sure everybody had enough challenges to keep them busy in any age. However, we do live in a social situation where the normal underpinnings of the Judeo-Christian ethic have, for all practical purposes, disappeared. They've disappeared from our law. They are totally absent from adult entertainment. In fact, we live in a country now where when you talk about adult entertainment, you mean dirty. This is really unusual. All sorts of things that kind of reinforced silently the higher background of our law, which once respected innocent human life. Much of that has been dismantled. The stable marriage and family life, divorce has been dismantled. We're even talking, the whole moral area is polluted. People are talking about a woman's right to her own body, meaning the right to kill an unborn, or someone else is talking about gay rights. These aren't rights, these are wrongs, moral wrongs. No one has a right to do what's morally wrong. Now, whether these are the best of times or the worst of times, I don't know. I do know this is the only time in which we have to live. Therefore, even though it may have been, there was a time when the social system, when the civil law system, when the education system all resonated and helped strengthen those underlying Judeo-Christian principles, that ball game may well be over. Now, we can sit down and cry on each other's shoulders about that. All I'm saying is we have to make more of an effort then to form and inform a correct conscience in the first place, because the society we live in will not do it for us. Many agencies of responsibility have ceased to be responsible. Therefore, it devolves more upon the individual young Catholic, the individual teenage Catholic, the individual adult Catholic, to form and inform a correct Catholic conscience in the first place. Besides that, obviously, certain aspects of civil and professional life have become a bit more complicated. In that case, again, more of an effort to clarify a correct conscience. To some extent, morality is like art. You got to draw the line somewhere, otherwise there's no picture. Now, I know there is a segment of modern art, Jackson Pollock or someone, where they don't really draw lines. It looks like they kind of chuck paint. But generally speaking, if you don't draw a line, you don't get a picture. You got to draw the line somewhere in morality, and every idea you can think of, and a few you haven't thought of, they're out there and they have their propagandists, and they're competing. They really are competing and molding mind. Therefore, what we may have said in the past were kind of reflected or resonated in our culture and in our education efforts and everything else. You make your own judgments about the state that we are presently in. I underline what I think is true and what I think is an accurate assessment of where we are. It is crucially important for every serious, sober Catholic to use all the means God gave him or her to form and inform a correct Catholic conscience in the first place, because no one else will do it for you. It has always been the case, but I think more so today than in other areas. Why? Because if we fail to act as we really judge is right, we come, in short order, to judge as we act and call it right, and that's not the same thing at all. If we fail to act as we truly judge is right, in a little while you kind of come to judge as you act and call it right. And that's why we say we cannot trivialize what's going on in this area. You can have a dead conscience, which is extreme. I think we all have partially Swiss cheese consciences. There are other terms we can use, some a tender conscience or a tough conscience or a sensitive conscience or a lax conscience or a scrupulous conscience. Most of those do need some refinement. But again, in this area. So besides the little maxim that you can always act on a certain conscience, and we shouldn't act on a doubtful one, we all have a prior and a primary responsibility to form and inform a correct conscience in the first place. So in summary, conscience is a judgment. It's a judgment. It doesn't invent law. It applies law, moral law. That's why we call it the internal norm of morality. When we say it's internal, we don't mean it is arbitrary or that it is subjective. We mean that everyone makes the decision, himself or herself, to take theoretical knowledge of whatever source and apply it here and now to their perspective, what they are about to do, and it becomes directive that this good is done and sought by me, that this evil is avoided by me, and it is directive, therefore, of their life. All right? But besides that, and besides the little maxims that we can always act on a certain conscience, and we don't act on a doubtful one, the prior and primary responsibility of forming a correct conscience is really crucial, absolutely crucial. It might help. Some years ago, the Canadian Catholic Conference, the Canadian bishops in Canada, put out a little booklet called the Statement on Formation of Conscience, which the Daughters of St. Paul have put in a tiny form here. This is a very good document. It zeroes in. To tell the truth, it's kind of trying to clean up in 1978 for something they said in 1968, which was pure fog. But this is a very good little document. It's worthy of adult discussion. The same good sisters, the Daughters of St. Paul, also have one called Conscience and Morality, which was put out by the Irish Episcopal Conference. This is a little bit more scholarly, at least in learned terms. It's completely almost in terms of Cardinal Newman's writings, which appeal greatly to some, but not to everyone. But in practical terms, it is absolutely crucial that we clarify the terminology, because in what we follow up the next time, I'll try to explain what we mean by so-called freedom of conscience, what that can mean and what that can't mean, but also we want to be careful of certain expressions that have been overused recently that don't reflect. It is important that we speak of a correct conscience or an erroneous conscience, a certain conscience or a doubtful conscience, because other terms have come into play which are a little bit misleading. One of them being good conscience. Yeah, you read some literature, you'll hear about a good conscience solution. I don't know what good conscience really means there. What it normally means, of course, is sincere. Sincere conscience. Every now and then you get people who get no higher in theology, basically, than Jane Fonda. Jane has a habit of saying, how can I be wrong when I'm so sincere? Jane, dear, you can be sincerely mistaken just as you can be sincerely correct. You know, it's like Charlie Brown. There he stands on the mound. How can I lose when I'm so sincere? Keep putting fat fastballs over the center of the plate. Someone's going to send them into orbit. You're going to lose, Charlie, even though you're sincere. Sincerity will not undo reality. I can be sincerely correct as I can be sincerely mistaken. Let's take for granted that every party to this discussion is sincere. If someone is insincere, that's a matter of bad faith. That shouldn't be camouflaged as some esoteric argument in conscience, but it's a judgment. Practical judgment. I can judge correctly or I can judge incorrectly. I give one Zippo example. The Eastern Shuttle, before they fixed it up down there at LaGuardia, first three aisles go to Washington, next three aisles go to Boston. Someone drops me off, I'm in a hurry. You can do it so fast that you make out a check on the plane. And on my way to Washington, I go zipping down aisle 5, jump on the plane, and I'm zinging along, going about 535 miles an hour in the wrong direction. Because I'm on the plane to Boston when I really wanted to go to Washington. I was sincere. The one who dropped me off was sincere. Sincerity will not undo reality because the plane's going the wrong direction. Someone could, in all sincerity of conscience, mistakenly drink poison thinking it's coffee. Are they guilty of anything? No, because they are sincere. But that poison is going to do a wicked job on your duodenum and the rest of your internal plumbing. So we want to be careful about certain, that's why I said in the beginning, I think we have a little strength in the noun, conscience, but beware of funny adjectives that really kind of derail the discussion and lead us down the wrong path. In summary, we can always act on a certain conscience, we never act on a doubtful one, but remember always the prior and primary responsibility of forming a correct conscience in the first place. That's the prime responsibility of a Catholic. If I fly that Catholic flag, then I, as a Catholic, have a prior and primary responsibility to form and inform my Catholic conscience in the first place. Okay?